She began her life on the lowest rung of Byzantine society, an actress, a performer, a girl whose name was whispered with scandal in the shadowed corners of Constantinople. And yet, within a few decades, she would become Empress Theodora, one of the most powerful women in human history. How did a woman with no noble birth, no wealth, and no family name rise to stand beside an emperor, rule one of the mightiest empires of the ancient world, and be venerated as a saint? This is not just the story of an empress, it's the story of a survivor who rewrote her destiny. When Theodora was born around 500 CE, the Byzantine Empire was dazzling and brutal, a place of gold and blood, saints and sinners. Constantinople, the beating heart of the empire, was a city of extremes. Towering domes gleamed over sprawling slums, and faith mixed with politics in dangerous ways. Her father, Acacius, was the keeper of bears at the Hippodrome, the grand arena where chariot races and political riots collided. Her mother, likely a dancer or acrobat, was part of the same entertainment world, vivid, scandalous, and despised by the elites. To the upper classes, entertainers were little better than beggars or courtesans. When Acacius died suddenly, Theodora's family fell into desperate poverty. Her mother, with 3 daughters to feed, turned to the only community she knew, the performers. She begged the Greens, one of the city's racing factions, to take her daughters into their troupe, but they refused. Desperate, she turned to the rival Blues, who accepted them. That moment, an act of survival, would shape Theodora's future more than anyone could imagine. From the age of 10, Theodora learned that power was not given, it was performed. She danced, acted, and entertained to survive. Chroniclers who despised her later described her early life in cruel detail, accusing her of scandalous behavior, calling her names that echoed through history. But beneath the venom lies another truth. Theodora was a young woman using the only means available to carve a path through a world built to ignore her. As she grew, her fame spread across Constantinople. Audiences adored her wit, her timing, her beauty. But Theodora wasn't content with applause. She listened. She learned. While the city's nobles sneered, she was watching them, studying their politics, their mannerisms, their hypocrisies. Yet even in her rising fame, her life was harsh. When she was barely in her teens, she became the companion of a high-ranking governor, Hecebulus, who took her with him to North Africa. The relationship quickly turned abusive. When she refused to bow to his control, he abandoned her in a foreign land, penniless and alone. That moment might have broken anyone else, but for Theodora, it was transformation. She made her way back across the Mediterranean, working her way home in the most brutal conditions imaginable, serving as a maid, performing in taverns, doing whatever it took to survive. By the time she reached Constantinople again, she was no longer the naive actress who had left. She had seen the world, its cruelty, and its hypocrisy, and she was done being powerless. It was around this time that she experienced a spiritual awakening. She met Christians of the Monophysite faith, a branch of belief considered heretical by the official church, and was captivated by their teachings of mercy and divine justice. She began to reject the life she had known. She left the theater, abandoned performing, and began a quiet life of charity and devotion. But fate had other plans. In the center of Byzantine power stood Justinian, a brilliant, ambitious general's nephew, a man destined to become emperor. He was fascinated by theology, obsessed with law, and determined to reform an empire riddled with corruption. But Justinian was also lonely, and when he met Theodora, something extraordinary happened. No one could have predicted it. He was over 40. She was barely 20. She was a woman with a scandalous past, yet their connection was undeniable. She challenged him, spoke her mind, and understood the common people in a way no noble ever could. Against all tradition, Justinian married her. To do so, he had to rewrite Byzantine law, literally change the empire's legal code to allow a man of senatorial rank to wed a former actress. And he did it. Because for Justinian, Theodora was not a mistress or a trophy. She was his equal. When he ascended to the throne in 527 CE, Theodora rose with him. The actress who once danced for coins now ruled from the golden throne of Constantinople. But the empire she inherited was not a fairy tale. Corruption festered in every corner, the people were restless, and enemies surrounded the city. Within 5 years, Theodora would face a test that would define her legend and decide whether history would remember her as a goddess or a ghost. By 532 CE, the Byzantine Empire was a glittering volcano, magnificent on the surface but ready to erupt. The streets of Constantinople thrummed with tension, and beneath its marble arches, centuries of class resentment, religious feuds, and political corruption boiled just beneath the gold. For Theodora, life inside the imperial palace was both magnificent and treacherous. She had risen higher than any woman before her, yet her past was still used as a weapon. Courtiers whispered behind jeweled fans, bishops sneered at her devotion. The senators, those ancient relics of Roman pride, muttered that an actress had no right to share the emperor's throne. But Theodora had learned something the elites never would. Power is not inherited. It is performed. Every gesture, every glance, every word from her mouth carried the weight of an empire. She was no longer a performer on the hippodrome stage. She was performing for history itself. And soon, history demanded her greatest act of all. It began with the races, the hippodrome. That vast arena where Theodora's father once worked was more than entertainment. It was politics in motion. 2 factions ruled the stands, the blues and the greens. The blues represented the upper classes, loyalists, and Orthodox Christians. The greens drew their strength from merchants, craftsmen, and monophysites, the faith Theodora herself sympathized with. At first, Justinian had tried to play both sides, but his reforms, harsh taxes and ruthless anti-corruption campaigns, angered them all. The city seethed with unrest, and when 2 members of each faction were arrested for murder and sentenced to execution, everything exploded. On January 13, 532, the races began as usual. The hippodrome overflowed with thousands, the sound of horses echoing beneath the stone vaults. But the chants soon changed. Instead of cheering for the teams, the crowd began to roar a single word: Nika! Conquer! It wasn't a cheer anymore. It was a rebellion. Within hours, the mob had stormed the streets. They looted the markets, burned the city's great buildings, and turned on the palace itself. Justinian's soldiers were overwhelmed. Even the imperial guards began to waver. For 5 days, the capital of the Byzantine Empire burned. Half of Constantinople was reduced to ash. The great Hagia Sophia was destroyed. Tens of thousands lay dead in the streets. Senators secretly plotted to replace Justinian with a new emperor, someone easier to control. Even Justinian himself, the man who had rewritten law and built an empire on intellect, began to falter. In the great marble hall of the palace, as smoke choked the horizon and the mob screamed outside the gates, Justinian called a council of his most trusted men. The air was thick with panic. His generals urged him to flee, to escape to the coast and sail away to safety. And for a moment, he nearly agreed. But then, Theodora stood. Chroniclers who despised her still recorded her words because they were impossible to forget. In a voice calm and resolute, she said, "My lords, flight is not for me. For one who has worn the crown, it is not fitting to live in exile. Purple makes a fine burial shroud." It was a single sentence, and it changed everything. The men in the room froze. Theodora, once mocked as an actress, had just reminded them all what it meant to be royal. She would rather die an empress than live as a fugitive. Her courage shamed them, steadied them, and reignited Justinian's resolve. In that moment, she became not just a queen, but a symbol of defiance, of the idea that a woman could embody the empire itself. Re-inspired, Justinian ordered his general Belisarius to act. With brutal precision, the imperial troops sealed the exits to the Hippodrome, where the rebels had gathered to crown their new emperor. Then, in a single devastating assault, the army stormed in. What followed was slaughter. Contemporary accounts say over 30,000 people were killed. The Hippodrome, once filled with cheers and music, ran red with blood. When the smoke cleared, the city was silent. The rebellion had been crushed, but at a terrible cost. And yet, from the ashes of destruction rose rebirth. Theodora stood beside Justinian as they planned a new vision for Constantinople, grander, holier, eternal. Together they rebuilt the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, whose vast dome would come to symbolize the glory of Byzantium itself. For centuries, pilgrims would gaze up at its golden mosaics and whisper her name, not as a sinner, not as an actress, but as an empress who saved an empire. The Nika Riots were over, but they transformed Theodora forever. She was no longer the girl who clawed her way up from poverty. She was the empire's spine, its unbreakable voice. And now that her power had been proven, Theodora would use it, not just to shape politics, but to rewrite the fate of women in the ancient world. After the Nika Riots, Theodora's name spread through every corner of the empire, not just as an empress, but as something greater. To the people of Constantinople, she was a symbol of divine resolve, the woman who had faced a mob of tens of thousands and did not flinch. The actress Empress, as her enemies still sneered, had become untouchable. From that moment on, Theodora ruled beside Justinian not as an ornament, but as an equal. Her signature appeared on imperial decrees. Foreign ambassadors bowed before her as they would before any emperor. She received audiences, delivered verdicts, and advised on matters of war and theology. In a world where women were supposed to remain silent, she spoke with authority. And no one dared interrupt. But power for Theodora was never about grandeur. It was about justice. She never forgot what it was to be powerless. The hunger, the humiliation, the endless vulnerability of being a woman in a man's empire. So when she finally had the chance to change it, she did. Under her influence, Justinian passed sweeping reforms, laws that gave women property rights, outlawed forced prostitution, and established safe houses, refuges of repentance, for women who wanted to escape the sex trade. For the first time, the empire acknowledged that women had souls worth saving, not just bodies to be used. These were radical ideas for the 6th century, and they didn't come from the Senate or the church. They came from Theodora. Her empathy, born of suffering, became her weapon, and with it, she transformed the very laws that had once condemned her kind. But her compassion extended far beyond the palace walls. She personally funded orphanages, hospitals, and convents. She helped survivors of natural disasters and famine. And though she lived surrounded by marble and silk, she never forgot the faces of the hungry children who once watched her perform for coins in the Hippodrome. Theodora's influence also shaped matters of faith. The great theological divide of her age between the Orthodox Church and the Monophysites threatened to fracture the empire. Justinian, the devout Orthodox ruler, sought unity through law. Theodora, quietly but firmly, protected the Monophysites from persecution. She offered sanctuary to their priests, gave refuge to their exiled leaders, and secretly corresponded with religious figures who viewed her as their champion. It was a dangerous game. She was balancing a knife's edge, one side faith, the other power. But Theodora had always lived on the edge. Still, even as her influence soared, cracks began to form in the golden facade of her reign. By the 540s, Justinian's empire faced its greatest trial. a shadow that swept across the Mediterranean, the plague of Justinian. It began quietly, carried by ships from Egypt, but soon consumed Constantinople. In a matter of months, tens of thousands were dead. The city of marble became a city of silence. Streets were filled with bodies, and the sweet smell of incense could not disguise the stench of decay. The emperor himself fell ill. For days, Theodora ruled alone, issuing decrees, commanding the treasury, holding together an empire paralyzed by fear. She refused to leave her husband's side. Chroniclers say she barely slept, feeding him with her own hands, praying by his bedside. And when he recovered, he found his empire in ruins, but not in chaos, because Theodora had held it steady. In those years, their bond became something almost mythic, not of passion, but of shared purpose. They were two halves of the same will, Justinian the lawgiver, Theodora the soul, but their unity had cost them dearly. Political rivals circled like vultures. Old allies whispered of overreach. Some called her a tyrant in jewels, others a saint in disguise. One story tells of a nobleman accused of treason who fled to a church seeking sanctuary. The mob demanded his death. Justinian hesitated. Theodora intervened. An emperor may fear the people, she said, but God will judge him for how he treats the powerless. She saved the man, and in doing so, reminded everyone, husband and subjects alike, that she answered to a higher law. Still, no mortal power lasts forever. By 548 CE, Theodora's health began to fail. The once radiant empress who had survived famine, scandal, and war now faced a slower enemy: cancer. She continued to appear in public, still regal, still commanding, even as her strength faded. Justinian, ever the scholar, turned to doctors and prayers, but nothing could save her. On June 28, 548, in the palace she had once ruled with fire, Theodora died at about 48 years old. Justinian was devastated. He locked himself away for days, refusing food or counsel. When he finally emerged, he wept openly before the court, something no Roman emperor had ever done. He ordered her body laid to rest in the Church of the Holy Apostles, beneath mosaics she herself had helped design. One of them, still preserved in Ravenna, shows her wearing a crown of gold and emeralds, holding a chalice, eyes calm, lips poised, a faint smile that defies the centuries. It's a portrait not just of a queen, but of transformation, from performer to empress, sinner to saint, mortal to legend. Theodora had once said that purple made a fine burial shroud, and in the end that prophecy came true. She died wearing the color she had fought for, the color of power, dignity, and survival.